Thanks very much. I rise to pay tribute to a former minister, former senator and dear friend who we recently lost, Graham Frederick Richardson. I use his full name as Frederick because Frederick was the name of his dad, and the experience of his father and the battles that happened within the Postal Workers Union formed a very significant part of Graham forming a view of the importance of winning, on the notion of how personal political fights can be, and effectively a big part of his formation and decision to be involved in the Labor Party. People would know that Graham has been ill for some time, but his death was still unexpected when it came. Some years ago he had some very major operations, but that was not the beginning of the challenges with his health. At the age of 16 there was a very serious car accident and Graham had last rites twice. Both his parents died relatively young, and Graham was always in a rush and always had a sense that he might not always be around. My political formation, a big part of it, some of it happened through my paper run, some of it happened through my concern about a series of environmental issues. But of those environmental issues, the one that I was most passionate about was the Daintree rainforest. And I had posters of the Daintree in my bedroom. I was writing to the then Prime Minister, Bob Hawke, as a kid, still at school. And eventually, when I joined the Labor Party, at my first branch meeting, the person who followed me up the street after I left, thinking I might never go back to that again, was someone with a mullet, in jeans, black T-shirt, by the name of Morris Yemmer, who had just started working as speechwriter for Graham Richardson. I saw a series of issues I'd been passionate about being delivered by Graham. The Daintree rainforest and wet tropics. We all talk about the Daintree, but the World Heritage listing went across the whole wet tropics. And Don Henry from the Conservation Foundation used to refer to the meeting with Graham where the environmental groups were explaining that they really wanted to save the Daintree and maybe add some of these other forests to it as well. And it was Graham who leant back and said, it's an easier campaign just to do the lot at the start. It was a controversial campaign. While the Daintree had its incredible significance of being that spot where rainforest and reef meet, you had some communities who were very angry of it, and it's sort of a lesson in the culture of protest that in that legendary visit where Graham was always willing to confront people he disagreed with, give them his view. He would often, in speeches, acknowledge that not everybody in the room voted Labor, but he believed they had a right to be wrong and he would defend that right. And when he turned up at Ravenshoe, it looked to the TV cameras like an absolute riot against him. People shouting, it had that apprehension of the possibility of violence. And Graham, rather than being intimidated by it, the moment he got into the car to leave, with the shouting and what most people would have thought had been a disaster, he turned to, I think it was David Tierney, was the one in the car with him, and said, well, we've just won that debate in the public, knowing exactly how it would look on the TV screens. But it wasn't just the Daintree, the Lemon-Thyme Forest in Tasmania, the Southern Forests, the work with Kakadu with respect to Coronation Hill. These are all legacies that will outlive Graham and are still there now, and as he would say, would even outlive his memory. These are conservation decisions that are around forever. But of course, while that was the issue that had got me active in many ways when I first joined the Labor Party, and Graham was such a champion of it, the speeches at the New South Wales State Conference were something different. And most people have never been to a New South Wales Labor conference, but it is a gathering of more than 1,000 people in the Sydney Town Hall. The seats, to get a sense of it, are not facing the stage, they're facing each other. It is a conference designed for conflict. And there would be the champion of the left speeches would be given by John Faulkner, and he would say some terrible things about the group that I was part of. And we would always know, and in fact, from time to time, John Faulkner would conclude his speech by saying, and the next thing that will happen in this debate will be that Graham Richardson will follow me. I haven't seen the speaking list, but every time I've spoken in the last 10 years, Graham Richardson has followed me, and he would. We even had conferences when they would get boring, and when the conference got particularly boring, Graham and John would manufacture a fight just to keep the delegates interested and engaged. He had a way of expressing himself and an absolute confidence and a way of asserting authority and power that he'd learnt from John Ducker, and always attributed John Ducker for that, which gave Graham, gave Richo a capacity to really be able to carry a majority. And his description as to what he expected of the delegates was he would always say, "You know who your friends are when they vote for you, even when you are wrong." And there were a couple of occasions, including some resolutions, one in particular, which was fairly directly designed to stop someone from ever getting into the federal parliament, which the fact that that's wrong is that person's now Prime Minister of Australia. But Graham then, when he came back to the ministry in 1993, after the Keating victory, he became Health Minister, and I had the privilege of being able to be the most junior member of his staff. And in working for Graham, I saw that capacity to be able to engage with everybody, whether you agreed or disagreed, and to find a way of getting your agenda through. Prior to 1993, and in terms of engagement with different organisations, this is something that sounds difficult to believe, but the then Labor government had got to the point where the Health Minister and the head of the AMA, the Australian Medical Association, didn't talk and hadn't talked for years. There was no communication at all. So the Australian Medical Association would run ads against Medicare and against the government every election campaign, and in response the approach of the then ministers was to simply say, well, we don't need to talk to you, there's no point. Richo decided that wasn't the way to get things done, and if you wanted to have serious reform, you needed to engage. But he had a technique. So every time a speech should be prepared for him, and Brett Gale, the speechwriter, and before him Maurice Yammer as speechwriter, just had to put up with the fact that Graham would insist every word of a speech would have to be written out. The fully written speech would be there. He would then tell the audience that he'd approved the speech. He'd then wait till he got there and say to the audience, well, I've been given a speech. You are not all good people, but you do not deserve this speech. Bag the speech, put it to one side and then go. The AMA one was a little bit different. Every time Brett Gale wrote a version of the speech, Graham said to him, not tough enough. They were the biggest donor to the Liberal campaign. You need to go harder. It went through 4 or 5 revisions until it was a blistering attack that he was there as the first Labor minister to turn up to their conference in years. Graham then, having distributed the speech to the media, embargoed against delivery, then said his usual thing about he wasn't going to use the speech, but instead of bagging it, he said, there's a speech that I've prepared, you've got copies of it, you deserve it. But at some point, we need to start working together. One of us has to take the first step, and I'm taking that now. As a method of engagement, of just owning exactly where he disagreed with people, being crystal clear about it, not taking a backward step, but also saying, if we care about Australia, we have to find a way to work together, was something that was a real shift, and something that I have to say in an extraordinary way I really learnt from Graham. I was devastated the day it was announced that he was resigning. For ministerial staff, or electorate staff as well, there is a real sense of what happens to me next on the days that the person you work for decides that they're leaving. Graham hit the phones and made sure that every single member of his staff was still going to be employed. Didn't have to do it, but continued to do that, and then also made sure some people on staff wanted books signed. One person asked for Machiavelli's The Prince to be signed, and I asked for a reference. Graham wrote me a reference. It said, "Reference for Anthony Stephen Burke. Tony is a mate, Graham Richardson." He assured me it was all I would ever need. After politics, Graham kept in touch with his staff. There were annual gatherings for some time, and once I got into Parliament, on your toughest days, the phone would ring, and it would be Graham. It'd be Graham taking you through how the different challenges and how he thought you might be able to find a way forward. Of course, the other time when Graham would always be on the phone, and sometimes you'd get him more than once a day, was whenever there was leadership instability, because Graham always had a view on what he thought the future of the party should be, and he was not backward in giving his views on that. Of course, he ended up post-politics with a wide variety of friendships, including on the other side of politics as well. Because of his work in recent years, I know that it's not just the Labor Party family that's grieving the loss of Graham, but it's also people around the chamber, and also in the press gallery, in particular his friends at Sky News. Graham had a knack of getting different groups of people together for lunches. Every group probably thought they were the inner circle. Because once he'd settled on a group, that'd be the group that would meet for the regular lunches. And he'd always be there. He'd choose the restaurant, he'd order the wine, and he would hold court and then listen and try to get his best sense as to where people were up to and where they were at. His dear friends, Leo Macleay and Peter Barron, were the inner circle. And it would have meant the world to Graham that at the moment that he passed, two of the people in the room there with him were Leo Macleay and Peter Barron. I've known Graham's family for almost as long as I've known Graham. And on my birthday, and you all know when my birthday was because I announced it to Parliament, but when it was my birthday, I got a message that night from Richo I got a message that night from Richo saying, "We need to have lunch again." And the next day, he said who he was going to invite to the lunch, and of course it was the same group of us where he pretended that we were the only lunch group that would get together. My birthday was on the Tuesday. The message about having lunch was on the Wednesday. And on the Saturday, my phone lit up with Graham Richardson. But it wasn't Graham on the phone, it was Amanda. And Amanda, it was only hours after they'd lost Graham, explained how suddenly everything had come on. And the day before, for the first time, even though Richo had, as I said, last rites back when he was 16 and had some terrible moments of health, acknowledged he was dying and had died in the very early hours of that morning. But Amanda said that Graham had always committed that he was going to, no matter how much pain, and he wasn't living comfortably, but he was determined to stay alive to see Darcy finish school. Yeah. Darcy finished his final exam the day before, and he was able to deliver on that commitment. The friendships of the people who were around the table at Graham's lunches will all continue. My personal friendship with Amanda, and I hope a growing friendship with Darcy, is something that I hope to carry for all of my life. The advice and the understanding of what can be achieved in this place, often achieved with Graham always wanting to maintain the facade of the tough, no compromises politician, the title of the book, whatever it takes. But I've got to say that's not the person I saw. I saw the moments of deep disappointment I saw the moments of frailty and working issues through. I also saw the moments where he knew but wasn't telling us that he was going to leave, and decided the best thing he could do as Health Minister, while he still had the authority and all his colleagues and the expenditure review people putting the budget together thought he was staying, was to use all his political capital to try to get the best possible outcome for Indigenous health. And he did that, waited for it to get through, and once the cabinet decisions had been made on that, decided it was time to tap the mat. Australia's a better place because Graham Richardson decided to engage in politics, and the Labor Party has had a mentor who we have deeply valued, who has been a strong character, a tough character, and at times an uncompromising character. Graham would be the first to acknowledge he wasn't perfect, but I'm so glad we had him, and I'm so glad for his family that they were willing to share him with Australia. God bless Richo. We miss you. All the best.
The question is the motion be